So we love you.
Wait, no.
We love you.
Daddy, how do you say what? We love you!
I'm not gonna lie, that's a very hard act to follow. There's no doubt about that. So, I'd like to thank you all for coming to an amazing evening tonight, an evening I've often heard Whitney refer to as Tracy Gaglio's second wedding. Now, Dan, if you would please place your hand on top of Whitney's and keep it there. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Seth Cohen, and I've known Dan my entire life. We grew up together, went to camp together, went to elementary, middle, and high school together. We moved out to LA and then lived together. As roommates, we've lived together so long that the state of California recognizes us as common law married. So to me, this is less of a wedding and more of a handoff. I mean, Whitney is kind of like the second wife. She's younger, more beautiful, and loves to be spoiled. So, if I can, Whitney, let me give you a couple of pointers of life with Dan. And believe it or not, you wouldn't know it, but I've put in a ton of work to get him to where he is today. I've lived through the fish head era, the Baja shirts, the oral fixation with TV remotes, the ears that were pierced, the senior year Skrillex haircut, and the summer he worked at TGI Fridays. And if you've seen his shoes tonight, you know he still loves to have at least one piece of flair at all times. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up for a moment. At age 5, Dan and I became friends because my parents said I had to. He was a nightmare when we were little. He'd come over and break all of my G.I. Joes. Men were torn in half, planes were in pieces. He destroyed everything for about the next decade. So, first thing to know, get used to things breaking. We used to think Dan was super clumsy, but we later learned he just has no control over his abnormally small hands and feet. Also, don't bring up the tiny feet thing. He gets very defensive. Number 2, as you may have noticed during the ceremony, he can't stand still. When it comes to Dan, there's a lot of bowing, shaking, restless legs, and general movement. I feel like scientists think that perpetual motion machines don't exist, but I guess they've never seen Dan after a latte. Whitney, just keep him busy. The phone normally helps. Number 3, you have to get used to adopting a new term. And the people from Boston and LA, what do you say when something terrible happens to you? You just got keetsed. Exactly. Getting keetsed means anything that can go wrong will go wrong. It's such an evil, mysterious force that J.K. Rowling has optioned it for her next book, Harry Potter and the Curse of the Constantly Delayed Flight. Getting keetsed is at its worst when traveling. That this is no joke. For Dan's bachelor party, we took a direct flight from Colorado and landed in New Mexico. That is a true story. But honestly, there's so many stories of Dan getting keetsed that I couldn't possibly tell them all. But I can do a montage. Age 9, on the school bus, Dan finds a barbecue rib and throws it towards the back of the bus. It hits an overweight girl and Dan is accused of a hate crime. Age 11, Dan finds matches and inadvertently lights the Schofeld's backyard on fire. 5th grade, Dan half-asses a penmanship assignment and is put into a special needs handwriting class. Camp, a squirrel gets into our cabin, launches off the top bunk, and clings to Dan's face. 8th grade, after a miscommunication, Cindy Harrington beats him up in the hallway. Word quickly spreads that a girl beat him up. 17, Dan lights a candle. It catches the ceiling tapestry on fire. Damn you, fish head error. Panicked, he drags it through the entire upstairs, scorching most of the carpet. Age 18, Dan takes coupons out of a neighbor's mailbox. Cut to, he is charged with a federal crime, mail fraud. Age 19, off from school, Dan works as an ice cream truck driver and runs into Cindy Harrington. She mocks his career choice while Dan hands her correct change and a SpongeBob pop. Age 21, the rematch. Off from school, Dan works as a waiter, and who walks in? Cindy Harrington and her entire family. The Harringtons tease Dan that their daughter beat him up, and to top it off, Cindy lies and says it's her birthday. Dan swears vengeance, but instead sings them happy birthday and serves her free cake. Los Angeles car dealership. Dan negotiates for his Jeep. It's $10,000. He has that in cash. He agrees in writing to pay $14,000. Jeremy and I take over negotiations. 6 years ago, Dan trips in a bouncy house. Damn you, tiny feet! And sprains his neck the eve before he flies 22 hours to Africa. And 3 years ago, in the final anecdote, while manscaping, Dan cuts off part of his nipple. Righty is permanently hard for the rest of his life. I know, this guy sounds nuts. But while he sounds crazy, I think there's another side to Dan that's equally worthy of a montage. And it's that you're lucky to grow up with him, spending your winters in his basement and summers on his porch. He's the guy you convince to join you at camp because it'll make it more fun, the guy you call through college because he always has a funny story, and a blast to live with because he's the life of the party, always down for adventure. He's loyal, dependable, sincere, hilarious. You're always happy to have him by your side and happy to call him best friend. Now, I always wondered who was special enough for this guy, and that's where Whitney comes into the picture. When they first started dating, Whitney, with the acumen of an accountant, opened Dan's books and knew some things needed to change. For starters, she sent him to her hairdresser, her gym, and spoke to him about the exciting real estate opportunities located around the Huntington Beach area. And it was also around that time I met the other woman Dan would be marrying, Tracy Gaglio. As most of you know, Whitney and Tracy have a super close relationship, speak roughly 27 times a day, and even have cool nicknames for each other. Tracy calls Whitney the beta bitch. I guess that means Tracy's the alpha, which makes sense because most of their arguments are settled by the phrase, yeah, but Tracy agrees with me. Sorry, Joe and Ryan, your opinions don't count. And over time, Whitney threw notes on the doors, emailed reminders, and 24-hour in-person help. Dan became more responsible, and it seemed like Whitney had answers for everything. Like if Dan couldn't find his pants, Whitney would merely say, "Don't worry, I'm wearing them." Or like when Whitney told Dan they were going to have a Jewish wedding, and Dan said, "But you're not Jewish." And she said, "Just give me 6 months." Whitney helped Dan so much that she was driven to inspire people like him. So naturally, she became an elementary school teacher. And over time, as their love started to grow, we noticed a change. Dan had fewer mishaps, follies, and mistakes. He was happier and better off. And we realized he was no longer getting Keatsed. He was getting Gaglioed. And anyone could plainly see that this was a couple that would stand the test of time, which is good because I've been told marriage is like a marathon. And if you're familiar with the way Dan runs marathons, he's gonna need someone to carry him over the finish line. And Whitney is perfect for that job. She's kind, sweet, resourceful, full of life, and brightens any room she enters. So I guess, looking back, I'm not losing a Dan, I'm gaining a Whitney, and apparently a Tracy. Now, Dan, do you remember how I told you to keep your hand on top of Whitney's? Well, that was just to show Whitney he's great at taking direction, and that's thanks to me. And finally, one piece of advice for Dan. Always remember, you may be a TV producer, but the beta bitch runs the show.